Hello, Inside Great Minds listeners. Today's episode is with Cheryl Einhorn. Cheryl came to us through a few connections, one of which I thought was really interesting is that her son had sold books with our sister company, Southwestern Advantage. But Cheryl also has a very esteemed background and track record, which is why I was really thrilled for this interview to come out. Cheryl had a background as a investigative journalist with Barron magazine, where part of her investigations would take her inside companies to determine on the bear market if there were reasons why people should be bearish on that company. So she would deconstruct some of the issues companies would have behind the scenes. And that method of research had led her down a long-term path of uncovering something called the area method, which is an evidence-based decision-making system that uniquely controls for and counters cognitive bias to expand knowledge while improving judgment. So very scientific approach, which is something I really appreciate about her approach to business. Most of our conversation also revolves around her new book, which is called Problem Solver: Maximizing Your Strengths to Make Better Decisions. And that was published in 2023. There, she takes a more personal approach to different decision-making profiles, which I also found very, very interesting. I think you're going to take a lot away from this interview with Cheryl in terms of how your decision-making might be impacted based on your profile. Her book delves deeper into that topic, but also just anecdotes on her story of going from investigative journalism to more of the world of business and strategic approach to how she coaches and develops people through her different systems. So without further ado, we'll jump into the episode with Cheryl Einhorn. In the beginning, I think I read this correctly, that the earlier career you had was working for Barron's, right? Where you did a lot of deep dive research on companies that had kind of a bearish outlook, I guess. And I would love to just hear a little bit about, number one, how you ended up in that position and job to start, and just some of the insights that you gained from that part of your career.
Sure. I still do a lot of writing, writing a lot of articles. I just had another article in Harvard Business Review, but I've moved away from those kind of investigative stories to much more, investigating the different ways that we solve our problems. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah. Well, I just, you had some great stories in there about how powerful some of the investigative work was, because some of the companies, the investigation proved to have a lot of merit, to be bearish on those companies, right? And I'm sure for you, I think you even suggested it, that afterwards you're like, wow, like that company went totally belly up because there was a lot wrong, right? And that's a big impact that you have as a journalist doing investigative research like that. But maybe you could also talk a little bit about, you were obviously quite good at that work. What made you stay in the same realm-ish, I guess, but transition to what you pursue now?
So I think, things like empathy and divisiveness, we strengthen the muscles around those types of skills, in part by how much we use them. And investigative journalism really builds, how do you identify a question that often in a social circle might be inappropriate, could sow the seeds of discord, could feel oppositional or prosecutorial. As I thought about it, I loved the job at Barron's, and I loved the research and the writing and the investigative stories, but I also felt, wouldn't it be nice to build my muscles and use some of these skills instead on the pro-social side, building relationships, strengthening relationships, finding ways to really build trust. And that was part of it.
Yeah. So it's almost on the flip side, because if you're investigating something, that means it's almost like the reactive side. Something's been done, right? That you're exploring that probably isn't necessarily healthy. And what you got into was how could we maybe prevent these situations from occurring in the first place? We were more proactive about our communication and decision making. I mean, is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think the other thing that I would say is um, that there's a lot to investigate about ourselves that we just don't know. We don't, I think until the problem solver profiles, everybody has these habits and patterns of behavior related to their decisions, but they may not know, well, why do I do it this way? Why does this feel comfortable to me? So I think there's a lot of investigation that we can do into things that are helping each one of us individually and helping that intersection for how we work with others.
Love it. And even though I don't end up spending, a whole chunk of the interview on this, a big thing we love doing when we bring people on the show is just taking a few minutes to explore the early life. Because I think people are really attracted to our guests' journey as much as they are about what they're an expert in. And I'd love also to just, before all of this, I mean, did you know at the time of high school, college that you were on this journalism trajectory, and then there's been some pivoting, or maybe you could just tell us a little bit about who was Cheryl back then and how did even the Barron's thing get started?
Yeah, it was an accident. There's this wonderful Buddhist statement about we've never been here now before.
Hmm.
And it was really just an unexpected moment. I had written for my high school papers. I wrote for one of the papers in college. And then as I was getting ready to graduate and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, one night there was a gentleman who was lost on campus. And he stopped me and asked me where this particular location was. And I said, oh, well, I'm walking that way. I'll walk you there. And we started talking, and he said that he was there from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism.
Mm.
I said, why would anybody need an advanced degree in journalism? Why would you need lessons in how to read, how to write, and how to speak with somebody? These are things we've done K through 12.
Mm.
And so we ended up in an interesting conversation. And at the end, he said to me, I want to send you something. Would you give me your address? And a couple days later in the mail, I got an application from the Graduate School of Journalism with a note from him saying, the J School needs people like you.
Hmm.
And I hadn't really thought about it. So that weekend, I decided I don't know what I want to do. I walked into the GREs and I took the GREs and I applied. And I figured when I got in, I have no idea what I want to do, but I want to hear other people's stories and I want to be able to work with people. And I thought no matter what I do, if I burnish my skills in reading, writing, and research, that's going to be a benefit. And so that's how it started.
Wow. I definitely appreciate that your approach and how you arrived at where you are today was through that field of journalism. I studied at University of Maryland and was pursuing journalism and before I switched to government and politics, and had done some interning, writing columns for papers, and enjoyed a lot of the research and the excuse it gave me to meet and talk and be curious about people. And I think one of the things that we found in a lot of these interviews in our podcast is this synergy around curiosity driving a lot of the success that a lot of our guests have. And ironically, I feel like, I mean, maybe not ironically, the whole problem solver book you wrote and a lot of your approach suggests a lot of curiosity and learning about people to get that information.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about so moved away from Barron's, and then you, from those lessons like you described earlier, you said, I think I have maybe a unique outlay and approach to decision making from having met and researched. I mean, was that kind of what laid the groundwork for you, is all these experiences studying the businesses that you had the opportunity to study, you started to compile your own research to figure this out?
Well, what ended up happening is these stories when I was writing for Barron's, which is a publication that has a viewpoint on investment opportunities, was that they had a really outsized impact. When the stories were published, sometimes the stock exchange had to halt the shares from trading because there was too much activity. Sometimes regulators got involved. For one company, a CEO ended up getting sentenced to 10 years in jail after a series of my investigative stories. Several companies went out of business as a result as well. And what I realized is that although journalism is really about truth to power, these stories weren't just hitting somebody in their investment portfolio. And therefore, it had an impact on if you worked at one of these companies. Could you get up and go there in the morning? Was the company still a going concern? Or if you had your retirement account in the shares of one of these companies, or if you were a consumer of one of these products or services. One of the companies that I did a very large set of investigative stories on was the largest maker of diabetic test kits. Now, this is a company, therefore, that makes a product that people invest their feeling and understanding of their health and wellness in every day. So what I began to think about was, how do I know that I'm telling stories that are true and that should be told? How do I know that I'm marshaling the right evidence? And then I'm also checking and challenging what we were beginning to learn at the time was these cognitive biases, these mental mistakes that we all have.
Yeah.
And so as I thought about this, the literature at the time was basically saying, all right, we all have these heuristics, these thinking flaws, but what they're basically giving us as a solution is to heighten our awareness. Well, if I'm heightening my awareness, doesn't that mean I'm sort of doubling down on these biased thoughts? And so without a system in place, I thought, well, my background is in research. What if I put together a system that can uniquely try to check and challenge these biases and try to pry open cognitive space for new information and new insight? And that's where this whole idea about thinking about decision-making came from. And that was really the origins of what I now call my area method decision-making system.
And this is maybe a personal question I'm curious about, because when you approach these what feel like enormous projects to design your own something, right? Whatever that is. I mean, how long did it take you from the moment you knew this would be a tool that would be highly useful, right? And if we're just talking about the area component itself, I mean, how long did bringing that to life take you?
No, I think it was a trial and error. And in the beginning, it was just me trying to do a more ethical job at work. That
Yeah.
was, I hadn't thought about using this for anybody else.
Hmm.
But there were a couple things that I thought had been missing in thinking about decision making. The idea of really addressing timing and strategic stops where you can chunk your learning and make your work for you. The idea of checking and challenging the biases. A unique step in decision making that looks at different data interpretation tools, because the same piece of data can have different diagnosticity depending upon the interpretation tool that you're using. And this idea of making sure that the other stakeholders were involved. And so I really was just through trial and error trying to put together a system that became the area method. And as I talked to other people about it, I started having people say things like, hey, I have a project that I'm working on my company, or my son's getting ready to apply for college, or I want to think about how to help my aging parents find the right housing accommodation. And so this really just began to be something that people were asking for. And then I realized, you know what? We don't teach decision making. We don't teach it in our schools. We don't teach it in home, but it is the only thing that we're ever going to have control over in our whole lives, is this ability to make our decisions. So if we actually can have a system that can help us to clarify our thinking, to include the other stakeholders, to understand the data that we're collecting, we have a better opportunity to move well into our future.
100%. I mean, it's at the core of everything, is how people make decisions, right? It determines their whole life. So for better and for worse.
My colleague Emma and I have been asking people one question. So at the beginning of this year, just why is decision making important?
Mm,
And the answers that we've been getting are exactly the kinds of things that you're saying,
mm.
right? To really be able to live your possibility, if you know that you can make decisions well, it gives you the courage, the resilience, and the confidence to move forward.
Yeah. One specific question that I generated from reading Problem Solver was, and I know this book speaks more to the SPS, which stands for. I kept reading the
Problem solver
acronym.
profiles. Yes.
Say it one more time.
The new book is called Problem Solver, Maximizing Your Strengths to Make Better Decisions. And this book is on the psychology of decision making and on problem solver profiles. It's
That's
the 5 different ways that people approach their decisions.
got it. Problem solver profile. So it's PSP, right? That's the acronym. Got it. Yeah. Our company has a bazillion acronyms too, so it all gets tangled in my head. But with this read, you'd mentioned also one of those conversations that popped up as you were developing your programming and these concepts was someone in the education realm approached you about the application for youth. And I was curious, diving into that a little bit more, when he approached you, it was to tackle decision making for teens that are around the high school age, correct?
Yes. So this was something I never knew I wanted to do. But this fellow who was one of the co-founders of what was called the Future Project, which is about really helping youth to identify their dreams and their goals, was this idea that maybe it could be developed for high schools because he had found that this was the #1 request that they got from principals, was how to help teenagers with decision making. And when I realized that this could be a very exciting time in somebody's life to engage with their decision making, it's really a period where people are really beginning to notice their own identity as distinct and separate from their family or their friends, I realized that it would be fun to gamify it. What if people could go on their own self-discovery and in just a few minutes identify a problem solver profile? And
Mhm.
so that was the genesis of this idea of developing an app that people could use, a short quiz, where it
Mhm.
takes about 5 minutes, and it will help you identify for yourself which one of these 5 dominant ways that I've identified that people tend to solve problems, which one's the most comfortable for you.
Mhm.
And then it will share with you a template of what is strong about the way you approach problems. And then what are some of the key cognitive biases, the mental mistakes that are most applicable for the profile that you've ended up in. And then the book obviously takes you through what do you do with that so that you can make better decisions alone and with others. And on this rainy Sunday, we piloted this app with a group of high school students from Newark and Brooklyn,
Mm.
and they were immediately excited about the results. And it was this beautiful moment where you saw how energized they were to get some information about themselves and a language, a lexicon with
Mm.
which to discuss this with other people.
And I'm curious because I know you use this with the professional marketplace and businesses as well. Did you end up creating like different variations by age group? Like do the high school ones complete like a different, or is it the same regardless?
It's the same.
Okay.
It's the same problem solver profile quiz, and it doesn't matter if you're a grandparent or if you're a teenager. The
Mhm.
way you use it might be a little different, but
Mhm.
I have found that this tool is so simple and yet so fundamental that it just unlocks relationships that have had problems for many years. In
Mhm.
my own personal life, this has transformed my relationship with my mother.
Yes.
So it gave me this new understanding and appreciation. And I also no longer thought that my way was better. We tend to be comfortable with our way, so we elevate our own focus for problem solving, and we tend to denigrate and look down on somebody else is hasty, somebody else has analysis paralysis. Why can't these other people make decisions the way that we do? But now what you can do is really have an appreciation for the fact that they're bringing a different and important lens to the way that a problem is solved, and that the magic is in combining the different lenses, the intellectual diversity of the 5 different problem solver profiles, which really give you a fulsome understanding of the problem for you.
I love it. Do you use, and maybe you could just do a very quick rundown also on the AREAS acronym that as part of your overall approach to decision making as well.
Great. I'll do an overview of that, and then I think it would be nice to do an overview of the 5 problems.
Oh, yes, yeah, I meant to ask you that too. Maybe ping.
So,
you do the 5 profiles first, and then we can tackle the other one.
Okay. So the 5 different problem solver profiles are the adventurer, the detective, the listener, the thinker, and the visionary. And each has some beautiful strengths, and each has a couple of blind spots, the cognitive biases that can impede clear thinking. So the adventurer is your optimistic, confident decision maker. She knows that if she makes a decision and it goes awry, she always has the next decision ahead. And that has an underlying optimism bias to it, because for her, the risk is not making a decision. It's not necessarily making the right decision. And so this optimism bias can lead her to potentially move too quickly, or maybe to not look at a lot of facts because she thinks right away that she knows a preferred pathway. The detective is somebody who likes the evidence. They really want facts. They can tell you what is underpinning their decision based on pieces of evidence. And this has an underlying confirmation bias to it. Because they're good at research, and I'm a detective, I can say to you, I can go ahead and find a piece of evidence that's going to support my thinking. Now, that's not as good as looking for disconfirming data, because you may have a whole bunch of pieces of evidence that support a favored hypothesis, but if there's one insurmountable hurdle, that hypothesis fails. The listener is our most collaborative decision maker. This is somebody who is cooperative, that wants to include the people, and believes the people and their centrality over different kinds of information. So they may have, as a cognitive bias, something like a liking bias, where they can overweight information from somebody who they have an affinity for, or even a social proof bias, where once their group of people seems to have a preferred pathway, they may have a tougher time identifying if they have a different thinking from their own inner voice. The thinker is our slowest problem solver profile. For them, the action is between the ears. They can tell you why. They know why they've made the decision. And for them, they really want to mitigate the downside. They would rather prevent the decision from failing than either identifying the best outcome possible or the best possible outcome. So they have an underlying loss aversion in that mitigating the downside over coming up with the best pathway forward. And then finally, we have our visionary. This is our creative thinker who wants something that is original. They can see possibilities, and they've got a clear North Star. And a downside for them, or a cognitive bias, might be scarcity bias, where they want to overvalue something that is original when something that is workaday would be just as good. And what I want to note here is that the problem solver profiles are not prescriptive. They're not going to tell you what you're going to do next. What they are instead is their habits and patterns of behavior that are very comfortable to you. So if you put in effort, you can change and you can grow as a decision maker. Think of it like handedness. Most of us feel most comfortable with our left or our right hand, and we do most things that way. If we want to be ambidextrous, we can do it, but it's going to take some intentionality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. I think of emotional intelligence. One of the key components of developing it is self-awareness, and that's what I think a lot of similar exercises, and this one in particular, is helpful for, because it's more about getting to know yourself, and through that, you can do something about it. Right? Once you acknowledge that there's something that might be missing, now you can always take action to remedy it. Right?
Well,
And
there's two pieces though, right? Because self-awareness is that first step. You have to sort of first notice what's going on. But then the second thing is giving the self-awareness directionality.
mm-hmm.
And it's really only as good as the directionality, because otherwise you don't know what to do with it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Right. Self-management.
right. And so what's really clear here is that because the 5 problem solver profiles are optimizing for different things, the adventurer for forward momentum, the detective for evidence, the listener for agreement with others or the inclusion of others, the thinker for the why, and the visionary for something that is original, you now have pathways opened for how to be able to speak to the incentives and motives of others. And it's those incentives and motives that drive behavior.
I'm kind of curious, because you do coaching and consulting through this tool as well. Like, you know, you find yourself just speaking coach to coach. You'll meet with someone who owns a company or runs a business. And in some kind of discovery, you find their strengths and what those blind spots are and the things they naturally gravitate towards. And oftentimes there's kind of 2 options, right? They can adjust some things internally about themselves, or they can reposition themselves in their own business and hire for the other traits. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you lean towards one? I mean, I guess yours is about evolving decision making, right? I mean, either way, it's good to understand your biases, but
Yeah.
I keep thinking of that leader that maybe is a visionary, or that leader that gravitates towards this critical thinking, that they can benefit from this other person who blends with them, right?
Don't think that either of these alone solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you truly want to solve that problem, there's a little bit of both, right? You adapting and
Mm-hmm.
understanding the team that you have, and you also hiring and bringing in some intellectual diversity to be able
Complementary
to do
strengths.
something. Actually, complementary is what's very interesting here, because one of the main examples in Problem Solver is of 2 visionary leaders, and
Mm-hmm.
they amplify each other's blind spots. So instead
Yeah.
of complementary, thinking, oh, they get each other, what they do instead is they run away with each other to some extent on the blind spots. And it's not until they really understood the implications of having 2 people that think the same way that they recognized that they needed to adjust, but that they also needed to make sure that they brought in some problem solver profiles that were quite different. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is an interesting point to amplify, because we naturally have an easier time making decisions with some people over others. And I think we would tend to think, oh my goodness, I'm a listener, I want to be with other listeners. But the truth of the matter is where you have tension, you also have opportunity to have a better understanding of the decision that you are facing, and therefore actually make a decision that has a higher likelihood of getting you closer to the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you just are, again, amplifying potentially those areas where you might actually want to be setting a speed bump for yourself.
Yeah. And you give that wonderful case study, the nonprofit, 2 visionaries, right? And how that amplified their blind spot, but they also recognized one of the reasons they really liked each other and got along is because they're the same type of person and their form of decision making.
And that got them off the ground, right? So the other thing that's interesting is sometimes you won't necessarily make that leap of faith unless you don't have somebody pressing pause.
Yeah.
Right? So the same thing that hurt them from developing a strategy and actually having a sustainable business model may have helped them early on to tackle such an insurmountable problem as child sex trafficking that many people would have said, you can't do that. There's no way that you could start that company, build that nonprofit organization, and so on.
You know, I think it's anecdotally, and as a someone who's developed a business and has led an organization, I felt like I've been in some of these situations, and sometimes business partnership is a little bit like marriage, right? Where if you're married to someone who's very similar to you, then sometimes it causes a compensation to be created where you become someone slightly different to compensate for that. So you might have two visionaries. And I was kind of curious to see if you've seen that where a migration happens where one becomes a little bit more, they need to be more grounded. So they become more of that detective.
I think it's a great point. For the story about this nonprofit that's in Problem Solver, once they realized what was happening with matching up two visionary problem solver profiles, we examined their secondaries and we looked at how we could bring forward some of the other tendencies that showed up within their complete problem solver profile to help them to be able to hold each other to a greater accountability. And in the beginning, it was very uncomfortable for them. And it is uncomfortable to make change. Most of us know this. At the same time, it served their relationship and it served their organization. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. I think all of the above. Yeah, sometimes if someone's out visionarying you go, okay, what I feel like the organization might need is some of this over here. So let me maybe gravitate towards that, even if it's not natural.
And I have a new article that's out in Harvard Business Review just on this topic called When Your Dominant Problem Solving Approach Fails. Because there are times where you say, gee, I'm generally pretty effective in the world. I feel pretty good about how I make decisions. Why am I having so much trouble with this problem or so much friction with this particular person? And when that happens, it's a really good opportunity to slow down and take a look at what is unique about that particular situation. I have in all my books something that I call cheetah sheets. And that is because the cheetah, while she's our fastest land animal, accelerating over 60 miles an hour, her hunting prowess actually comes from her ability to decelerate up to 9 miles an hour in a single stride. And that builds agility, flexibility, and maneuverability. And that's what we need in quality decision making. This opportunity to put in a strategic stop to say, do I want to stay the course or do I want to pivot? And so in this article and in my new book, Problem Solver, I have a cheetah sheet, which is a series of questions that you can answer that follow a logical progression to diagnose these kinds of problems between people and in decision making so that you can unlock what's happening and then get onto a better pathway to both strengthen that relationship and to solve that problem better.
I'm smiling because I love that there's application in the book and these tools that you provide. I was thinking as I was looking through that oh, you know, Cheryl kind of announced at the beginning of this book she was a detective, and you could kind of feel it coming through the book because you're like, oh, I love these tools, like this would be great. And you can see on a totally different decision making style the person that writes the book that just has tons of stories and you know, it's like story after story, but no like, you know, maybe element of technical, right? There's that missing piece, but I could see that just all these tools that you provide throughout your book kind of resonated with that part of you. And it's very, very useful, right? It's a very useful tool.
Thank you. Here, I'll describe the AREA acronym that you asked me
Yes.
for. So AREA is an acronym for the steps of my decision-making system that is meant to control for and counter cognitive biases so that we can expand our knowledge while improving our judgment. So the A in area is absolute information. It's information from up close on the target of our decision. So say you're thinking about which college to apply to, it might be the colleges that you are thinking about, and information just from that perspective. What does Johns Hopkins say about them? How is that different from, let's say, University of Michigan? And letting the absolute targets talk for themselves. Then the next step is R. I call it relative information. It is the sources related to the target of the decision, but outside of it. In this case, in the college example, this might be, well, what do the US News and World Report rankings say about these schools? What does Rate My Professor say about the professors? What does College Confidential say about the ecosystem of the schools? And then in exploration, you're now getting beyond document-based sources to upgrade your research by understanding the difference between the map and the terrain. This is where you actually talk to people to identify how that information actually sits together. So if absolute helped you to identify your colleges and relative puts them into its ecosystem and context, then in exploration, you might find out, gee, people love these two schools, but at Johns Hopkins, if you want to be pre-med, it's such a hot major, you can't get into the classes. So that's something that you may not get from document-based sources, but you can find that out from the people, and so on. The next part of area E is exploitation. Here's where we turn the lens of inquiry on ourselves, and we really look to control for and counter our cognitive biases by using creative exercises from a variety of disciplines, such as the intelligence community or investigative journalism. So here you might take a look at all the information you have so far and use one of these exercises to actually understand the diagnosticity of the data that you have and how you uniquely have interpreted it, maybe through the lens of the biases that have been getting in your way. And in the final step, analysis, now the magic is, how do you put it all back together and make it have meaning for you personally? Well, here's where we think about failure. And I call this making your mistakes before you make them. Here you might, in this final step, you have a favored hypothesis. You think you know which college, for example, you're going to choose. And I would recommend that you do in this step a pre-mortem. The post-mortem is the autopsy after a patient has died to find out what caused the death. In a pre-mortem, you imagine failure before you've made the decision so that you can identify the weaknesses in the decision that you're going to make, hopefully be able to then set up some ways that you can prevent the failures that you've identified, and also hold yourself accountable so you won't have evolving hypotheses. It will show you what would be the signpost for when the decision fails so that you know when it's time to make a new decision. And then the process helps you to come to conviction, to make your decision. So what I hope you see is that the area method is meant to help out with this mental myopia, the cognitive biases. It also shows you that decision-making is not a logical progression. We'd like it to be linear, but it's actually a feedback loop. So at times, parts of the process will send you back to earlier steps. Maybe you've glossed over some piece of information. Maybe you need a different kind of analysis. It also builds in strategic stops. It makes sure that you have stepped into the different perspectives of the decision targets itself, of the related sources, of actual people on the ground, of assessing your own cognitive biases, and therefore it gives you a chance to more holistically solve your problems.
You know, and one of the things that I always come back to as it relates to some of these practices is that I got into coaching because I hired a coach at one point. And one of the greatest benefits that coach provided me was seeing my blind spots and letting me know when they're occurring. And, you know, and so I think that self-management tools are fantastic. I think it's incredibly valuable to have an outsider point it out, especially in the beginning, until you are truly more aware of those. And so this might be a personal question, but I was kind of curious. I'm always like to ask this because as practitioners, we're always good at pointing out other people's challenges because we can see them very clearly. Who does that for you, Cheryl? Like, who's the person in your life or people in your life that gets to like say, Cheryl, you're doing that bias thing?
So there's a couple people, but I really would
Yeah.
want to give a shout out to my colleague, Emma Trout, because she's an adventurer and she so beautifully is able to show me another way of approaching everything.
Mm.
Also reflecting back to me how very detective and how very stuck in the mud I can be. So I appreciate her every day.
Mm.
And I also have a mom who's an adventurer. And I
Mm.
have a son who's a listener. And I'm surrounded by people who make decisions differently than I do. And one of the things that the problem solver profile has given as such a gift to me is that every conversation has this moment of mystery in it. If I can listen for the signals that somebody else is solving problems differently, I can notice that the conversation that I'm in is generally larger than I think it is.
Mm.
There's generally more possibility and there's more things going on than what I've entered from my own expectation. Because
Mm.
my expectation as a detective is often very focused on data and on facts. And that can really miss the people. And all of these other profiles view the people
Mm.
in a different light. So it's just been a gift for me.
Mm. I love that. One question I always slide in because I think it gets an interesting answer. You've obviously taken different career paths since you were a 21-year-old. Um, Knowing everything that you know today and what you've learned, what advice do you think a 21-year-old Cheryl would get from you if you could go back in time?
Yeah, I think on the same note about the people, it is about the people.
Mhm.
We're always in relationship to others, and our ability to build relationships and maintain relationships and lean on relationships gives so much meaning to everything that we're doing. So we had talked about the Buddhist saying earlier about we've never been here now before. If we can notice the people right in front of us and the moments that we're in, I think I was too much of a hurry in my younger self.
Mm.
And I think that there were opportunities there where I could have had more joy with other people. And
Mm.
so I think that is the piece of advice that I would give. You don't need to be in a hurry. There's so much right in front of you if
Mm.
you can take notice of it.
Love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's great. That's great feedback. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been really insightful and educational. I know we could make it a 2-hour interview to unpack loads of other stories and strategies because there was a lot just in your book. But I think what you provided here was really useful for our audience too. So if they wanted to inquire more, learn more about this process, where can they go?
So thank you so much for this conversation. If you want to reach out to me, please check out my website. It's areamethod.com, AREA method.com, and you'll find there my TED Talk and my books and my article and a little bit about my work. And I hope that you will learn your problem solver profile and reach out about the decisions that you're making.
Love that. Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Cheryl. Appreciate your insights. And we'll look forward to maybe a follow-up interview here again.
I'd like that. Thanks so much.